At 4 p.m. on June 6, 1944, 6 Horsa gliders carrying D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry descended through darkness toward 2 bridges spanning the Caen Canal and Orne River near Bénouville, France, their wooden fuselages creaking as they banked at 90 miles per hour just 300 feet above German-occupied Norman farmland, navigating by moonlight toward landing zones measuring barely 150 yards in length. The gliders carried specialized Bangalore torpedoes, collapsible assault boats, and prepositioned charges designed for rapid bridge demolition denial tools, adapted specifically for vertical envelopment operations that British Army doctrine had dismissed as suicidal just 18 months earlier. The eastern bridge lay 400 yards from the lead glider's calculated impact point, defended by an estimated 50 German troops from the 736th Grenadier Regiment, with reinforced concrete pillboxes, commanding both approaches and prepositioned demolition charges wired to destroy the span within 120 seconds of alert. British Joint Planning Staff assessments from March 1943 had calculated that airborne troops attempting night glider assault against fortified river crossings would suffer 70–85% casualties before reaching their objectives, with bridge capture probability rated at less than 15%. This was documented proof that institutional military skepticism about vertical envelopment could be measured in minutes and overturned by the sound of wood splintering against Norman soil. The operation represented the culmination of a technological and tactical evolution that most professional military minds had rejected as fantasy. Airborne forces soldiers delivered to battle by parachute or glider had existed in military imagination since 1918, but practical implementation remained trapped between engineering limitations and doctrinal contempt. The British War Office had observed early Soviet parachute exercises in the 1930s with detached curiosity, noting them in intelligence summaries as interesting demonstrations without tactical value. American observers had been more blunt. Major William C. Lee's 1940 proposal for large-scale airborne divisions was filed with assessments questioning whether paratroopers could carry sufficient ammunition to survive more than 30 minutes of sustained combat. The mathematics seemed insurmountable. A fully equipped paratrooper could carry perhaps 80 pounds of equipment, less than half what infantry typically required for extended operations. Gliders offered greater payload capacity but presented their own absurdities. Engineless aircraft, towed behind bombers, released miles from target zones to glide silently through darkness toward fields that might contain anything from grazing cattle to concealed anti-aircraft positions. German military thinkers had briefly entertained airborne concepts more seriously. The Fallschirmjäger German paratroopers had achieved tactical surprise in operations against Fort Epernay in Belgium during May 1940, and again during the invasion of Crete in May 1941. Epernay particularly demonstrated what vertical envelopment could accomplish. 85 German engineers landed by glider on the fort's roof, bypassed its formidable defenses entirely, and forced Belgian surrender within 24 hours. Yet Crete proved the concept's apparent limitations. Despite achieving strategic surprise and eventually securing the island, German airborne forces suffered approximately 4,000 casualties, nearly 25% of the assault force, with entire battalions effectively destroyed in the first 48 hours. Adolf Hitler reportedly concluded that the day of the paratrooper is over, and redirected Fallschirmjäger units toward conventional infantry roles. If Germany, the nation that had pioneered blitzkrieg and combined arms warfare, considered airborne operations too costly after Crete, conventional wisdom held that the concept was militarily bankrupt. British military planning throughout 1941 and early 1942 reflected this skepticism. The Army's Directorate of Military Operations maintained that parachute troops might conduct limited raids or sabotage missions, but could never hold ground against determined counterattacks. Detailed staff assessments emphasized that airborne forces lacked organic heavy weapons, artillery support, armored protection, and reliable resupply. A parachute battalion might seize an objective through surprise, but without link-up with conventional ground forces within 12–24 hours, the position would become untenable. The mathematics of attrition favored the defender. Airborne troops consumed ammunition faster than they could be resupplied by air, while defenders could reinforce continuously by road and rail. Several senior British officers argued privately that airborne divisions represented wasteful allocation of scarce transport aircraft that could be better employed in strategic bombing campaigns or maritime patrol. Winston Churchill himself had expressed doubts. In a minute to the Chiefs of Staff dated July 1941, Churchill questioned whether Britain could afford to divert resources toward exotic formations when conventional divisions remained under-equipped. He noted that 5,000 paratroopers required the same manpower as a standard infantry brigade, but could not perform a brigade's functions in sustained combat. The Prime Minister's concerns centered on opportunity cost. Every transport aircraft dedicated to airborne operations meant one less aircraft available for ferrying supplies to besieged Malta or conducting raids over occupied Europe. This represented a fundamental challenge to airborne advocates. They needed to prove not merely that vertical envelopment could work, but that it could work better than conventional alternatives consuming equivalent resources. The skepticism extended beyond high command into tactical doctrine. British Army training manuals from 1941 contained no sections on airborne operations because staff officers saw no point training conventional units to cooperate with forces they considered militarily irrelevant. Infantry school curricula ignored vertical envelopment entirely. Artillery officers received no instruction on providing fire support to troops without road access. The institutional knowledge required to make airborne operations effective simply did not exist within the British military establishment, because that establishment had concluded such knowledge would never be necessary. Yet operational realities in 1942 began forcing reconsideration. The Combined Operations Headquarters, responsible for planning raids against occupied Europe, confronted a persistent problem. German coastal defenses were becoming increasingly sophisticated. By mid-1942, the Atlantic Wall incorporated extensive obstacles, minefields, and fortified positions that made amphibious assault extraordinarily costly. The disastrous deep raid in August 1942, where Canadian forces suffered approximately 60% casualties attempting to seize and hold a heavily defended port, demonstrated that frontal assaults against prepared positions produced casualty rates that Allied public opinion could not sustain. Strategic planners needed methods to bypass enemy strengths rather than confronting them directly. Simultaneously, Allied intelligence began understanding the structure of German defensive doctrine. Wehrmacht's strategy emphasized mobile reserves and rapid counterattack rather than static linear defense. German commanders preferred to hold coastal areas lightly, then deploy armor and mechanized infantry from inland positions to crush beachheads before they could consolidate. This approach created vulnerability. German counterattack doctrine depended on rapid movement along specific road networks, which in turn depended on bridges, causeways, and other transportation chokepoints. If those chokepoints could be seized and held during the critical first hours of an invasion, German mobile doctrine would collapse into disorganized piecemeal attacks. The question became whether any Allied force could seize such positions ahead of a main landing force and hold them against inevitable counterattacks. Airborne forces offered theoretical solutions to this problem, but theory required validation through practice. The British 1st Airborne Division, formed in late 1941, spent months developing techniques through trial and error. Early exercises revealed cascading problems. Paratroopers scattered widely during drops. A battalion might land across several square miles, requiring hours to assemble. Navigation proved extraordinarily difficult. Pilots approaching drop zones at night rarely achieved accuracy within 1,000 yards of intended release points. Equipment containers frequently landed miles from their intended recipients, leaving troops without anti-tank weapons or heavy machine guns. Gliders offered better precision but introduced different hazards. Pilots had essentially one attempt to land correctly, with no engine power to compensate for errors, and glider construction was so light that hard landings frequently resulted in structural failure and casualties before combat even began. The operational requirement for the Normandy invasion crystallized these challenges into specific objectives. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, planning documents from late 1943 identified the Caen Canal Bridge and Orne River Bridge near Bénouville as critical to the success of British landings on Sword Beach. These bridges provided the only viable routes for German armor from the 21st Panzer Division, positioned southeast of Caen, to reach the invasion beaches. If the bridges remained in German hands, panzers could counterattack British landing forces within 2-3 hours of H-hour. If the bridges were demolished by German engineers, British forces would be unable to advance inland from Sword Beach toward the city of Caen, a D-Day objective that planners considered essential for establishing defensible beachhead perimeters. The bridges needed to be captured intact and held against counterattack until relieved by forces advancing from the beaches. A mission profile that seemed purpose-designed to validate every criticism ever leveled against airborne operations. Initial planning proposals suggested multiple alternatives to airborne assault. Special Air Service, SAS, teams might infiltrate by boat and attempt to seize the bridges through stealth, but SAS doctrine emphasized hit-and-run raids rather than holding fixed positions. Commando units landing with the main invasion force could race inland to secure the bridges, but this approach risked arriving too late. German engineers might destroy the spans during the confusion of the beach landings. Heavy preliminary bombardment could destroy German defensive positions around the bridges, but this would alert defenders and might damage the bridge's structural integrity. Every alternative analysis returned to the same conclusion. Only airborne assault offered reasonable probability of capturing the bridges intact during the narrow window of strategic surprise preceding the main landings. Major General Richard Gale, commanding the British 6th Airborne Division, received the mission in January 1944. Gale understood that failure would vindicate every skeptic who had ever questioned airborne operations' viability. Success would require solving problems that no military organization had previously resolved: how to land troops within yards of a defended objective at night, how to achieve tactical surprise despite arriving in loud, vulnerable aircraft, and how to transition instantly from air movement to ground combat with sufficient violence to overwhelm defenders before they could react. The mission demanded precision that exceeded demonstrated airborne capabilities by an order of magnitude. Gale assigned the operation to D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, universally known as the Ox and Bucks, commanded by Major John Howard. The choice reflected careful calculation rather than arbitrary selection. Howard had demonstrated exceptional competence during training exercises, but more importantly, his company had been practicing glider assault techniques for months. The unit had developed specialized drills for rapid egress from gliders and immediate assault on fortified positions, with each platoon rehearsing specific roles until actions became automatic. This represented a crucial insight. Airborne operations required fundamentally different training than conventional infantry tactics. Soldiers needed to transition from aircraft to combat instantaneously, without the gradual approach marches and deliberate deployment that characterized normal infantry operations. The planning for Operation Deadstick, the codename for the bridge assault, consumed months of meticulous preparation. Royal Engineers constructed full-scale replicas of both bridges in southern England, using aerial reconnaissance photographs to ensure accurate dimensions. D Company rehearsed the assault more than 60 times, practicing night approaches, rapid exits from gliders, and coordinated platoon movements against the mock-up bridges. Rehearsals revealed and corrected dozens of small problems: equipment that snagged on glider interiors during rapid exits, Bangalore torpedoes that proved too heavy for individual soldiers to carry while running, communications procedures that failed when radios were damaged during landing. Each iteration refined procedures incrementally, building institutional knowledge about glider assault operations that no military manual contained. The glider selection itself required innovation. Standard Horsa gliders could carry approximately 30 troops, but achieving the precision required for deadstick meant reducing payload to increase pilot control. Engineers removed unnecessary equipment and reduced troop loads to 28 per glider, calculating that lighter gliders would be more responsive during the final approach. Pilots practiced night navigation using terrain features and moonlight reflection from water surfaces, developing techniques to identify the narrow strips of land between the two bridges that would serve as landing zones. The insertion plan called for 3 gliders to land adjacent to the Caen Canal Bridge, 3 more near the Orne River Bridge 400 yards to the east. Each glider crew rehearsed their specific approach path hundreds of times using sand tables and aerial photographs, memorizing every tree line, field boundary, and building that might be visible from the air. Weapons loads reflected the specialized nature of the mission. Each platoon carried extra Sten submachine guns rather than standard rifles, emphasizing close-quarters firepower over range. Bangalore torpedoes would breach wire obstacles. Gammon bombs improvised explosive charges using plastic explosive and cloth bags provided anti-tank capability without the weight of PIAT launchers. Royal Engineers assigned to each platoon carried specialized demolition equipment to disable German charges on the bridges. Every weapon and piece of equipment had been selected for rapid deployment scenarios where seconds would matter more than sustained firepower. Intelligence preparation proved equally critical. British intelligence had identified the German defensive positions through aerial reconnaissance and ultra-decryption of Wehrmacht communications. The 736th Grenadier Regiment held the sector, with approximately 50 troops defending each bridge, machine gun positions in concrete pillboxes covering both approaches, trenches flanking the canal and river, and demolition charges pre-positioned on the bridge structures themselves. German doctrine called for engineers to destroy both bridges immediately if an Allied invasion appeared imminent. This created a race condition. Howard's troops needed to overrun German positions faster than defenders could reach the demolition control points. Intelligence estimates suggested German engineers could detonate charges within 90–120 seconds of recognizing an attack. The assault would succeed or fail in the time it took to sprint 100 yards under fire. The broader operational context added pressure. Deadstick represented merely one component of 6th Airborne Division's D-Day missions. Simultaneously with Howard's glider assault, 3 parachute brigades would drop farther inland to secure the division's eastern flank, destroy bridges over the Dives River to prevent German reinforcement from that direction, and neutralize the Merville Battery, a coastal artillery position that threatened Sword Beach. The entire divisional plan depended on achieving multiple objectives simultaneously across a 10-mile front, any one of which might prove decisive. If Deadstick failed but other missions succeeded, German panzers would still reach the beaches. If Deadstick succeeded but the Merville Battery remained operational, naval forces supporting the landings would face devastating fire. Success required coordinated execution across dozens of semi-independent actions, each presenting its own impossibilities. Weather added another variable beyond human control. Airborne operations demanded specific meteorological conditions, sufficient moonlight for navigation, relatively calm winds to prevent gliders from being blown off course, and reasonable visibility for pilots. The narrow window of favorable tides for the amphibious landings limited D-Day options to just a few days each month. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, would need to balance meteorological requirements for airborne, amphibious, and air support operations simultaneously, a combination that might not occur at all during the planned timeframe. The possibility existed that Deadstick would be cancelled not due to military concerns, but simply because weather refused to cooperate. Training intensified through April and May 1944. D Company relocated to secure compounds where troops lived in isolation, preventing inadvertent security breaches. Soldiers knew they were preparing for an important mission, but received no information about target location or timing. Security protocols reflected SHAEF's obsession with preventing German intelligence from learning Allied invasion plans. Every man in D Company represented a potential security liability, a drunken comment in a pub, a letter home mentioning training details, or simple capture by German agents could compromise the entire operation. Howard maintained discipline through transparency. He told his men honestly that the mission was dangerous, that preparation would be exhaustive, and that success depended on absolute precision. This approach built unit cohesion through shared understanding rather than blind obedience. The final briefing occurred on June 4, 1944 at Tarrant Rushton Airfield in Dorset. Howard spread aerial photographs across tables and revealed the targets for the first time. The Caen Canal Bridge, later renamed Pegasus Bridge in honor of the operation, and the Orne River Bridge lay in parallel, connected by a 400-yard stretch of road. Howard assigned specific objectives to each platoon. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge's 25 platoon would take the Caen Canal Bridge's western end, Lieutenant David Wood's 24 platoon would secure the eastern end, and Lieutenant Sandy Smith's 14 platoon would serve as reserve and handle the pillbox positions. The 3 gliders destined for the Orne River Bridge carried Lieutenant Dennis Fox's 17 platoon, Lieutenant Tony Hooper's 22 platoon, and Lieutenant Todd Sweeney's group. Each platoon memorized its specific approach routes, assault positions, and fallback points. The briefing lasted 6 hours, with soldiers asking detailed questions about fields of fire, obstacle positions, and German bunker locations. Weather initially forced postponement. Eisenhower had scheduled D-Day for June 5, but storms in the English Channel made amphibious landings impossible. The 24-hour delay meant troops who had been loaded aboard aircraft on June 4 had to disembark, wait, and reload on June 5, a process that added psychological strain to already tense soldiers. Some men tried to sleep. Others cleaned weapons repeatedly. A few wrote letters they knew might never be sent. The waiting represented perhaps the worst part of combat operations. That suspended interval between final preparation and actual execution, when soldiers could do nothing except contemplate what might happen in the next few hours. At 22:56 hours on June 5, 1944, 6 Halifax bombers began towing the 6 Horsa gliders carrying D Company down Tarrant Rushton's runway. Each combination bomber and glider, connected by a 350-foot nylon rope, required careful coordination during takeoff. The Halifax pilots needed to build sufficient speed for both aircraft to become airborne while ensuring the glider didn't lift off prematurely and stall. The sound of 24 radial engines at full power reverberated across the Dorset countryside as the combinations climbed into darkness. Inside the gliders, troops sat on canvas benches along each fuselage wall, equipment piled in the center, faces barely visible in the dim red light from shielded lamps. The wooden glider frames creaked and flexed with each air current, sounds that might have been alarming to inexperienced passengers, but which these soldiers had learned to interpret through dozens of training flights. The route to Normandy traced a carefully planned path. The formations flew south to the English coast, then turned east along the Channel, staying over water to avoid German radar stations on the French coast. Near Cabourg, the formations would turn south, cross the coast, and proceed inland to the release point 6,000 feet above the target area. The entire flight would take approximately 90 minutes, during which pilots maintained radio silence and navigated by dead reckoning, checking landmarks against memorized terrain features when moonlight permitted. Each Halifax crew had practiced the route multiple times, but training flights occurred over England with clear landmarks and no enemy opposition. The actual mission would require navigating over blacked-out occupied territory, where a single navigation error could place gliders miles from their intended landing zones. At 7 hours on June 6, Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, piloting the lead glider carrying Howard and Brotheridge's 25 platoon, felt the tow rope release. The sudden silence after 90 minutes of engine noise felt profound. Gliders produced only wind noise, the whistle of air across canvas-covered wings, and the occasional creak of wooden structural members. Walwork had approximately 5 minutes to locate the landing zone, establish his glide path, and put 28 soldiers onto a strip of ground measuring roughly 150 yards long and 50 yards wide. At night, surrounded by enemy positions. The glider descended at approximately 1,000 feet per minute, limiting Walwork's margin for error with each passing second. The Caen Canal appeared below, moonlight reflecting off the water's surface exactly as aerial reconnaissance photographs had shown. Walwork could see the bridge's distinctive outline and the darker shapes of buildings in Bénouville. He had memorized this view during months of study, but aerial photographs never fully conveyed the disorienting experience of approaching terrain at 90 miles per hour in darkness with no engine power for corrections. Walwork aimed for the pond adjacent to the bridge, using its reflection as his primary reference point. The other glider pilots, flying slightly behind and to either side, would take their cues from Walwork's landing, adjusting their approaches to avoid collision while still landing close enough to coordinate the assault. At 16 hours, Walwork's glider struck the ground with violent force. The wooden skids beneath the fuselage were designed to slow the aircraft through friction, but at the glider's landing speed they mainly produced noise, a tearing, grinding shriek as wood raked across Norman soil. The glider bounced once, the impact so severe that Walwork's safety harness broke and he was thrown forward into the cockpit controls. The second impact collapsed the nose section, and the glider slid forward, decelerating from 90 miles per hour to 0 in approximately 3 seconds. Inside the fuselage, troops were slammed against their harnesses, equipment flew forward, and the sounds of splintering wood mixed with the grinding of earth beneath the hull. The glider stopped 47 yards from the bridge's western end, close enough that troops could see the bridge's outline through gaps in the shattered nose. The second and third gliders landed within seconds. Sergeant Jeff Barkworth's glider touched down 100 yards behind Walwork's, his approach slightly longer but still acceptable. The third glider, piloted by Staff Sergeant Stan Pearson, landed farthest from the bridge but still within the designated zone. All 3 landings occurred within approximately 90 seconds, placing 3 platoons on the ground within mutually supporting distance. At the Orne River Bridge 400 yards east, the 3 additional gliders were executing similar approaches. Though their landings would prove less precise, one glider would land several miles off target due to navigation error, but the other 2 would successfully deploy their troops near the objective. Howard, momentarily stunned by the landing impact, recovered and shouted the prearranged signal. "Come on, lads." The rear doors of each glider had been removed before takeoff to facilitate rapid egress. Troops poured out, some stumbling as they adjusted from the cramped glider interior to open ground, others moving immediately toward their assigned positions. The entire scene occurred in near total darkness, broken only by moonlight, no illumination flares, no tracers, no visible enemy activity. For approximately 30 seconds, the only sounds were boots on grass and the metallic clatter of equipment. Then German machine gun fire erupted from the pillbox on the bridge's western approach. The MG-42 gunner had been alerted by the sound of gliders landing and was firing blind toward the noise, tracers arcing across the landing zone in long bursts. The MG-42's characteristic rate of fire, approximately 1,200 rounds per minute, created a distinctive buzzsaw sound that veterans found unmistakable. Brotheridge's 25 platoon immediately moved toward the bridge, running directly into the machine gun fire. Brotheridge himself led the charge across the bridge's roadway, a decision that reflected both his leadership style and tactical doctrine that emphasized immediate aggression to exploit surprise. The German defenders reacted with confusion rather than coordinated defense. The glider landings had occurred so rapidly and precisely that German troops could not determine what was happening. Some defenders thought the gliders were aircraft that had been shot down and crashed. Others recognized an attack but could not assess its scale. Were these the vanguard of a major invasion or simply a small raid? The 736th Grenadier Regiment's training emphasized demolishing the bridges if threatened, but the standing orders required officer confirmation before detonation. That requirement created a decision bottleneck. Soldiers recognized an attack but hesitated to take irreversible action without authorization, while officers were being awakened or were attempting to understand the situation from fragmentary reports. Brotheridge reached the bridge's western end and began crossing. The bridge was approximately 60 yards long, a steel truss structure that rose slightly as it spanned the canal. German defenders on the eastern end included the MG-42 position and a concrete pillbox covering the approaches. Brotheridge's platoon followed him, moving in fire and maneuver bounds, some soldiers advancing while others provided covering fire. The tactical situation had devolved into the most elemental form of combat, small groups of men trying to close with and kill each other across open ground. The side that maintained momentum and aggression would likely prevail. Approximately halfway across the bridge, Brotheridge fell. A burst of machine gun fire struck him in the neck and he collapsed onto the roadway. Sergeant Wagger Thornton, running immediately behind Brotheridge, continued forward, throwing grenades toward the German positions on the eastern end. The rest of 25 platoons surged across, firing Sten guns from the hip, the reports of their weapons mixing with German rifle and machine gun fire. The engagement occurred at such close range that aimed fire became impossible. Soldiers simply pointed their weapons toward enemy positions and fired, relying on volume rather than precision. Wood's 24 platoon moved toward the canal's eastern end through the trench systems adjacent to the bridge. These trenches, dug to German specifications with proper traverses and firing positions, should have provided excellent defensive positions, but the speed of the British assault prevented defenders from occupying them effectively. Wood's men cleared each trench section with grenades and close-range fire, a process that training had made automatic. The elimination of each German position reduced defensive fire incrementally, degrading the Germans' ability to organize coherent resistance. Within approximately 5 minutes of landing, 25 platoon had secured both ends of the Canal bridge. Thornton and several other soldiers reached the pillbox on the eastern end and neutralized it with grenades pushed through the firing slits. Other troops moved methodically through the German defensive positions, clearing bunkers and trenches. The most critical objective, locating and disabling the demolition charges on the bridge itself, went to the Royal Engineers accompanying the assault force. Sappers found the charges exactly where intelligence had indicated, packed into chambers on the bridge's understructure, wired to a detonation control point in a nearby bunker. The engineers cut the wires and removed the charges' detonators, rendering them inert. The bridge was secure and intact. Howard received radio confirmation from Fox at the Orne River Bridge that objective was also secured, though fighting continued at some positions. Howard transmitted the prearranged success signal, ham and jam, indicating both bridges were captured. The message went to 6th Airborne Division headquarters, then up the chain to SHAEF. Staff officers who had calculated low probability of success received confirmation that airborne troops had achieved objectives that conventional planning suggested were nearly impossible. The next challenge began immediately, holding the bridges against counterattack. German forces in the area would recognize the bridge's importance and attempt to retake them. Howard's company numbered approximately 180 men, the troops from all 6 gliders minus casualties from the assault and the glider that had landed off target. This force needed to defend against German units that could reinforce by road with armor and artillery support. The tactical mathematics seemed insurmountable. Light infantry without anti-tank weapons holding fixed positions against mechanized forces. Howard established defensive positions on both bridges, using German trenches and positioning troops to cover the approach roads. The company's only significant advantage was that German forces would need time to organize counterattacks, time during which British paratroopers from the main 6th Airborne drop would be landing farther inland and presumably drawing German attention. The first German counterattack developed around 1:30 hours. Elements of the 716th Infantry Division, alerted to the situation, moved toward the bridges from positions south of the canal. The counterattack lacked coordination, companies and platoons arriving piecemeal as they received orders and moved to the sound of gunfire. Howard's troops engaged each German element as it appeared, using the defensive positions they had captured to fire on approaches they could not have prepared themselves. The MG-42 that had fired on the British assault now provided defensive fire against German troops trying to recross the canal. The fighting devolved into confused small unit actions in darkness, with both sides uncertain of the other's strength and positions. At 2:20 hours, Brigadier Nigel Poet arrived at the Canal Bridge. Poet commanded 5th Parachute Brigade, whose drop zones lay approximately a mile east of the bridges. Poet's own landing had scattered him from his unit, and he had spent the past 2 hours moving toward the sound of firing, gathering paratroopers as he advanced. His arrival with approximately 60 additional troops provided Howard with reinforcements and also confirmed that the main airborne operation was proceeding despite the inevitable confusion of night drops. Poet assessed the tactical situation and confirmed Howard's dispositions. The bridges were the critical terrain, and they needed to be held regardless of cost until relieved by forces advancing from Sword Beach. German counterattack intensity increased through the pre-dawn hours. Around 300 hours, the first German armor appeared, elements of the 21st Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion probing the bridge's approaches. The sound of tracked vehicles alarmed Howard's troops, who possessed limited anti-tank capability. PIAT launchers had effective range of approximately 100 yards and required clear shots at thin armor. German tanks could engage British positions from well beyond PIAT range using their main guns and coaxial machine guns. The tactical equation favored armor overwhelmingly in open terrain. Yet the bridges themselves created a tactical constraint that favored the defenders. The narrow bridges could accommodate only one vehicle at a time, creating a bottleneck where German armor could not maneuver. A disabled vehicle on the bridge would block all following vehicles. This transformed the engagement from an open-field fight where armor dominated into a restricted engagement where PIAT teams might achieve success through careful positioning. Sappers moved PIATs to positions covering the bridge approaches, waiting for German vehicles to enter the kill zones. The first German armored vehicle A Panzer IV approached the Caen Canal Bridge from the south at approximately 3:30 hours. The tank moved cautiously, commander scanning for threats, main gun traversing to cover potential ambush positions. British troops held fire, allowing the tank to advance onto the bridge. At 40 yards range, a PIAT team fired. The warhead struck the Panzer IV's front armor and detonated, the explosion momentarily illuminating the entire bridge. The tank stopped, smoke pouring from hatches, blocking the bridge. German infantry accompanying the tank retreated under British fire. The destroyed tank remained on the bridge until after D-Day, a monument to the tactical advantage of prepared positions in restricted terrain. Additional German probes occurred throughout the night and into the morning of June 6. None achieved sufficient concentration to overrun the British positions, but collectively they prevented Howard's force from consolidating or resting. Troops rotated between fighting positions and brief rest periods, maintaining alertness through adrenaline and training. The sky began lightening around 500 hours, revealing the extent of the night's action, destroyed vehicles, scattered equipment, and the unmistakable signs of hasty defensive preparation. Dawn also brought aircraft, British and American planes, passing overhead toward targets deeper in Normandy. The sound of massed aircraft engines provided audible confirmation that D-Day was proceeding on schedule. At 1300 hours on June 6, troops from the 2nd Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment advanced from Sword Beach and made contact with Howard's positions at the Caen Canal Bridge. Lord Lovett's 1st Special Service Brigade arrived shortly afterward, Lovett's personal piper playing as the commandos crossed the bridge, a gesture that struck some observers as absurdly theatrical, but which reflected the relief that both airborne and beach forces felt at successfully linking up. The bridges had been held for approximately 13 hours against multiple counterattacks. The 21st Panzer Division's planned move to Sword Beach had been delayed and disrupted, forcing German armor to use alternative routes that added hours to response times. The operational outcome matched strategic planning exactly. Airborne seizure of key terrain had prevented German mobile doctrine from functioning effectively during the critical first hours of the invasion. Brotheridge, who had fallen on the bridge in the first minutes of action, became known as possibly the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day. His death represented both the cost of aggressive tactical leadership and the razor-thin margins that characterized airborne operations' success, often separated from failure by individual actions in the first seconds of combat. The soldiers who followed Brotheridge across the bridge had maintained momentum despite seeing their officer fall, a reaction that training and unit cohesion had made automatic, but which required extraordinary discipline to execute under fire. The operational success of Deadstick reverberated through Allied military planning. Major General Gale reported that the glider assault had achieved objectives with casualties far lower than expected, approximately 2 killed and 14 wounded during the initial assault, contrasting dramatically with the 70–85% casualty predictions that had characterized earlier planning estimates. The precision of the glider landings challenged assumptions about airborne delivery accuracy. Walwork's landing 47 yards from the bridge represented navigation and piloting skill that exceeded what planners had considered reliably achievable. The fact that 5 of 6 gliders landed within effective distance of their targets suggested that with proper training and preparation, glider operations could achieve tactical precision comparable to conventional infantry operations. Intelligence analysis of German defensive response revealed critical insights into the value of surprise and rapid assault. German after-action reports indicated that defenders had been unable to determine the scale of the attack during the first critical minutes. The combination of night operations, rapid glider landing, and immediate assault had created decision paralysis among German commanders, who hesitated to commit reserves or authorize bridge demolition without understanding what they faced. That hesitation provided the window Howard's troops needed to seize and secure the objectives. The lesson was clear. Airborne operations' value lay not in sustained combat power, but in achieving decisive action during the narrow window of surprise before defenders could react effectively. The broader D-Day airborne operations demonstrated both the potential and limitations of vertical envelopment. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropping on the Cotentin Peninsula experienced wide dispersion, with some paratroopers landing miles from intended drop zones. Yet even scattered airborne forces achieved strategic effect by creating confusion and uncertainty among German defenders. Wehrmacht commanders received reports of paratroopers across a 30-mile front and could not determine where main Allied efforts were concentrated. This uncertainty paralyzed German decision-making, preventing coordinated counterattacks during the hours when they might have been most effective. The operational lesson extended beyond tactical success. Airborne forces created strategic effects disproportionate to their numbers by disrupting enemy command and control systems. Post-operation analysis by SHAEF staff officers concluded that airborne operations had proven decisive to D-Day success. The assessment noted that without airborne seizure of key objectives, German counterattacks would likely have reached the beaches during the vulnerable first 6-12 hours of the landing. The Utah beach landing succeeded largely because the 101st Airborne controlled the causeways across flooded areas behind the beach, preventing German reinforcements from reaching coastal defenses. British landings at Sword Beach succeeded partly because the 6th Airborne held the eastern flank, preventing German forces from enveloping the beachhead. These were precisely the effects that skeptics had claimed airborne forces could never achieve, holding ground against counterattacks long enough for conventional forces to link up. The tactical innovations developed for deadstick influenced subsequent airborne operations. The emphasis on rehearsal and detailed planning became standard practice for glider assault missions. Training regimens incorporated lessons about rapid egress and immediate assault that D Company had developed through trial and error. Equipment modifications, lighter loads, specialized weapons mixes, pre-positioned demolition tools became doctrinal standards. Glider pilot training emphasized precision navigation and landing techniques that had previously been considered optional refinements. The institutional knowledge that British staff officers had dismissed as unnecessary in 1941 became foundational to airborne doctrine by 1945. German military response to Allied airborne successes included doctrinal reassessment. Wehrmacht planning staffs recognized that their defensive strategy had been compromised by losing control of key terrain during the first hours of invasion. Post-war German analyses noted that Allied airborne operations had achieved exactly the effects German Fallskirmjäger had achieved at Ebenemail bypassing, prepared defenses to seize critical objectives through surprise and rapid action. The difference was that the Allies had learned from Crete's costly lessons and developed methods to minimize casualties while maximizing strategic effect. German commanders concluded too late that Hitler's decision to abandon airborne operations after Crete had surrendered a capability that proved operationally decisive. The evolution of airborne doctrine continued through late 1944 and 1945. Operation Market Garden in September 1944 demonstrated that airborne forces still face significant limitations when operating beyond the range of rapid ground force relief. The British 1st Airborne Division's costly failure at Arnhem showed that even elite airborne troops could not hold positions indefinitely against sustained counterattacks by armored forces. Yet Market Garden's lessons refined understanding rather than invalidating the concept. Airborne operations required careful integration with ground force timelines, with link-up occurring within 24-48 hours of insertion. The mission profiles that failed like Arnhem involved holding positions for 4-5 days, which exceeded airborne capabilities. The missions that succeeded like Deadstick involved holding for 12-24 hours until relief arrived. The Rhine crossings in March 1945 incorporated airborne operations as integrated components of combined arms offensives. Operation Varsity, supporting the 21st Army Group's Rhine crossing, placed airborne drops immediately behind the river, with ground forces crossing simultaneously. This approach compressed the timeline between airborne insertion and ground force link-up to hours rather than days, eliminating the window where airborne troops faced sustained counterattacks without support. Varsity's success demonstrated that airborne operations had matured from experimental tactics to reliable components of military planning. Post-war military education incorporated airborne operations into standard curricula. The staff colleges that had ignored vertical envelopment in 1941 taught detailed courses on airborne planning by 1946. Infantry schools integrated training on cooperating with airborne forces. Artillery officers learned techniques for supporting troops without road access through aerial resupply and forward air control. The institutional dismissal that had characterized pre-war attitudes transformed into institutional expertise, with airborne operations becoming assumed capabilities rather than experimental theories. The technological evolution continued through the Cold War. Helicopters eventually superseded parachutes and gliders for tactical insertion, offering advantages in precision and flexibility that fixed-wing aircraft could never match. Yet the fundamental concepts validated at Pegasus Bridge remained relevant: surprise, rapid seizure of key terrain, and holding objectives until relieved by conventional forces. The methods changed, but the tactical principles endured. The soldiers of D Company returned to quiet recognition rather than celebrity. Howard received the Distinguished Service Order. Several soldiers received military medals. Walwork and the other glider pilots received Distinguished Flying Medals. These awards acknowledged exceptional performance but did not capture the broader significance. These men had validated a military concept that institutional authority had dismissed as impractical. They had demonstrated that careful planning, intensive training, and tactical innovation could overcome limitations that appeared insurmountable in theoretical analysis. The Caen Canal Bridge was officially renamed Pegasus Bridge in 1944, honoring the 6th Airborne Division's shoulder patch depicting the mythological winged horse. The bridge became a memorial site, preserved as a monument to the operation. Tourists visiting Normandy today can walk across Pegasus Bridge and see the preserved Horsa glider that stands near the landing site. These monuments commemorate specific soldiers and specific actions, but they also represent something broader: evidence that military innovation often emerges from practical necessity rather than theoretical planning, and that soldiers executing missions can prove capabilities that headquarters staff considered impossible. The documentary record of Deadstick remains remarkably detailed. Unit war diaries, after-action reports, intelligence assessments, and personal accounts provide minute-by-minute reconstruction of the operation. This documentation serves military historians, but also serves as institutional memory evidence of how tactical problems were identified, how solutions were developed through practice, and how execution under combat conditions validated or invalidated planning assumptions. The story is not primarily about individual heroism, though heroism occurred. The story is about systems, preparation, and the organizational learning that transforms theoretical concepts into operational capabilities. Military skepticism toward new concepts serves valuable functions. It forces advocates to prove capabilities rather than relying on theoretical claims. The skepticism surrounding airborne operations reflected legitimate concerns about casualty rates, logistical sustainability, and tactical limitations. Yet Deadstick demonstrated that skepticism must yield to evidence. When gliders placed troops 47 yards from their objective, when bridges were captured intact within 5 minutes, when positions were held for 13 hours against counterattacks, these facts superseded theoretical predictions. The same staff officers who had calculated 70–85% casualties confronted actual casualties under 10%. The difference between prediction and outcome measured the gap between institutional assumption and battlefield reality. The Normandy invasion succeeded through the integration of multiple capabilities: naval gunfire, air superiority, armor, infantry, and airborne operations working as coordinated components of a unified plan. Isolating any single element as decisive oversimplifies the campaign's complexity. Yet the airborne operations, particularly Deadstick, demonstrated capabilities that conventional forces could not replicate. No amount of naval bombardment could have secured the Caen Canal Bridge intact. No conventional infantry assault could have reached the bridge before German engineers demolished it. The mission required the specific combination of surprise, precision, and speed that only airborne insertion could provide. In that sense, the skeptics had been asking the wrong question: not whether airborne forces could replace conventional forces, but whether they could accomplish specific missions that conventional forces could not. The sound of wood splintering against Norman soil in the early hours of June 6, 1944, marked the moment when theoretical airborne capability became documented operational fact. 6 gliders had delivered troops to defended objectives with precision that exceeded planning assumptions. Those troops had captured critical bridges through aggressive assault that overwhelmed defenders before they could react. The bridges had been held against counterattacks until relieved by conventional forces advancing from the invasion beaches. Every phase of the operation had succeeded despite institutional predictions of failure. The documentation existed not in theoretical staff papers, but in captured bridges, destroyed German equipment, and the reorganized doctrine that followed. Military skepticism serves essential functions, but military effectiveness ultimately depends on recognizing when evidence contradicts assumptions and adjusting doctrine accordingly, regardless of how firmly those assumptions were held.